Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
We have two guests today on the Cognitive Crucible. First is a Cognitive Crucible alum, Dr. Jon Roginski, who is the program manager for the West Point Insider Threat Program and assistant professor of the mathematical sciences at the United States Military Academy. And joining John today is Stephanie Jaros, who is an insider risk expert with 15 years of experience in program design, implementation, assessment, and research across government and industry. Currently, she is a visiting research scientist and lead scientist for personnel security research at the University of Maryland's Applied Research Laboratory for Intelligence and Security, or ARLIS. Jon Roginski and Stephanie Jaros, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you for having us. I very much appreciate it.
Absolutely, John. Thank you for the opportunity to share our thoughts with you.
Absolutely. And so the conversation I'd like to have with you today, John and Stephanie, will unsurprisingly cover insider threat and workforce protection. But before we get into this big and important topic, could we please start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape?
Sure. So I like to start off all conversations or speaking engagements with the disclaimer. I am not speaking on behalf of the Department of Defense or ARLIS or the University of Maryland. These are my opinions. That being said, I think they're good opinions. In 2025, I think looking back over the last 10 years, our insider threat programs and insider risk programs and our discipline really as a whole has really come a long way. Many programs that you see in and outside of government, they're designed to be proactive. They're not just reactive. They're not just waiting for something to happen. And the practitioners in our field, they're working and being trained to prevent insider threat incidents without infringing on employees' civil liberties or their privacy rights. And the good news is that many of our organizational leaders, I think they see the purpose of these programs, but on the other side, they're still often seen as purely cost centers. They're not necessarily seen as cost avoidance centers or even business lines that add value. And I really think at this point that we need to shift this perspective because these programs demonstrate a company or an agency's commitment to protecting its assets, including its people and its customers and all of their data and their information from potential harm or compromise. And so strategically, then, I think we need to ensure our programs are safe, or at least as safe as they can be from downsizing or market forces. Like cybersecurity programs, I really think that insider risk programs should be a required company or a required part of a company's portfolio. Rather than seen as just a nice to have or something that becomes mandatory only after an event happens, which we still see happening, particularly in the private sector. We want our insider risk programs to be a consistent resource for people. And I think they can only be that if leadership advocates for them and we have strong, constructive voices in our community that work to establish a clear mission and vision.
I wonder, Stephanie, and you mentioned cyber programs in your response there. Is there an analogy with cyber, or are there any other analogies that would apply? And what I'm thinking about here is, risks that most sober people would recognize as risks, like cyber, but like people, I'm sure, were talking about cyber related risks in the 1970s and 1980s, right? But perhaps some of those risks were getting um, we're not getting the attention that they deserve because, come on, what's the likelihood, right? But nowadays cyber risk is like a vivid problem that has the attention of the entire world. Do you think that there's an analogy with, yeah, like yesterday's cyber, risk discussion and today's insider threat discussions?
I think there are several analogies. The one in the government that I've heard most often is post 9/11 counterterrorism and how the priorities needed to shift and how quickly that group of people and the discipline was able to professionalize and came to the forefront of government attention and most likely private sector attention as well. Cybersecurity as well, I think is a good analogy. As more and more incidents have become commonly shared, people know about these things. And more importantly, they have a personal investment in having their data protected. And when we have seen insider threat events, like a workplace violence shooting, um, you know, or like a high profile espionage case or a high profile intellectual property case, we are reminded as well that we have a personal investment in the existence of these programs.
So I think now might be a good time. Could one of you please define what insider threat means, as well as workforce protection in the context of today's organization? So, and maybe sketch out how these concepts differ and why it's crucial to distinguish between them.
Yeah, sure, John. I'm happy to jump in here. I think the ideas behind insider threat have been well defined, and they've been well defined for a decade or more. And typically, we like to focus on things like fraud, espionage, spillage, whether it's intentional or unintentional. Um, but I think that we're leaving a little bit on the table. Um, what I would like to do is I would like to get out and look at what the ends are. What do we want to accomplish? And what we want to accomplish is a safe workplace environment, safe in really all aspects, from not only information transfer, but the human dimension of safety. And so that's why we want to introduce this idea of workforce protection, because when we get out to valuing the people that are inside of our organizations, it's not only whether or not we have a misplacement of intellectual property, but these same leading indicators towards why somebody is more predisposed to committing fraud or to committing some kind of espionage, or even the spillage, or being predisposed towards this kind of idea. They have a lot of the same leading indicators towards why people participate in things like sexual assault, sexual harassment, um, workplace violence, right? They're all the same. These are the people that feel like they are ostracized or pushed out of the center, pushed out of the core of the organization. And so, what we would like to be able to do is identify, okay, where are these folks? How can we make our workforce more whole, more resilient, and more productive? How can we develop a better team? I think that as we talk about these kinds of things, it is a more holistic and a more productive conversation than this idea of insider threat, right? When we talk about threat, what we're really talking about is, are employees looking at each other as potential threat vectors? Well, that's not great for organizational culture.
Mm.
What about instead if we looked at each other and said, how do we protect each other? How do we make each other, or facilitate the making of each other into our best selves? That's what we want to really do. And if we're able to do that, we dry up the ecosystem that leads to threat behavior, I think.
Right.
I would just add, a couple of months ago, John and I published an article in West Point's Managing Insider Risk and Organizational Resilience Journal, or the Mirror Journal. And we introduced this concept of workforce protection because, like John said, these behaviors are not just the result of individual circumstances. Individual circumstances are important, but they happen in context. The organizational factors are in place that will make it more or less likely that an incident will happen. And by continuing to call it insider threat or insider risk, we place the responsibility and our investigative focus, our training focus, our messaging squarely on the individual. And we wanted to move away from that because our discipline has moved away from that. We know that it's more complicated than that. And we've been saying that for quite some time now. And so workforce protection, we think, is a phrase that recognizes that organization, recognizes the circumstances, recognizes the individual, and is more in line with the work that we've been doing now for several years.
I see. And we'll have a link to that article in the show notes for members of our audience who would like to go back and check that out. Um, I think perhaps we can start looking a little bit more into what you guys are referring to as the rare event problem in predicting insider threats. Could one of you elaborate on this challenge and discuss, some of its implications for program development and evaluation?
Sure. I'm happy to talk about that. And a great example is that since President Obama signed his executive order establishing insider threat, we've worked between 5 and 6 billion hours as a DoD, and we've had something like dozens of tragic insider threat incidents. When you look at that in context, it's just too complex to be able to make some kind of forecast or some kind of prediction. Yet that is where we seem to be, right? In 2025, we feel like we can sprinkle some AI dust or some machine learning dust on a problem and come up with an answer. But the reality is that the human is still important. And so what we must do is use the analytics to point decision makers in the right place, but not ignore the humanity in the problem. Because it's that humanity that matters. And so we have to make sure that we are not placing expectations on science that science cannot deliver. And right now, science cannot deliver a definitive determination of how humans are going to be. And so we have to remember that. We have to remember that the human must stay in the loop. and that's I feel like that's important.
Right, for sure. So, how do you guys balance the need for security with the importance of maintaining a positive and trusting work environment? And so, what are some of the potential consequences of an overemphasis on security measures?
So over the years, this has been something that has been a really interesting and sometimes hard lesson for me. Um, in general, how we create and develop and message our programs really depends on our organizational culture, right? How we design our programs need to fit into the way that we do business. The goals of the program should derive what needs to be protected, and the scope and who's included needs to be derived from who has access to our organization's critical assets. But, and this is the lesson that's been interesting and sometimes difficult, we can't always assume that all companies actually want a trusting and positive work environment. That's actually not a priority. That's not why they're there. And some do, and many do, in fact, but not all. And does that mean, we have to ask ourselves, well, does that mean that these companies don't need one of the programs that we work to build? And the answer is no. Um, it means, in fact, that every program will look different. And so over the years, I've shifted the way that I talk about these things, because I don't think as professionals, our job is to necessarily dictate what a company should do. But our goal really should be to be very clear to company leaders, to decision makers, about what the risks are of the choices that they make. We want them to be able to make informed risk-based decisions that are informed by research, that are informed by best practices. So we can actually explain to them, for example, if I wanted to advocate for a positive or trusting work environment, I would then get up and I would talk about the link between toxicity in the workplace, to individual disgruntlement, to insider risk events and concerning behaviors. And fortunately, there is plenty of information out there to be able to make this case. But at the end of the day, those organizational leaders need to decide for themselves what and how these programs are going to do and what they want to look like.
Right. These, I'm sure these kinds of discussions pop up in, this discussion space frequently, but, when we experience all too frequently uh, mass shooter events in the United States, you know, people inevitably start researching the uh, activities of the shooter, days, weeks, and months before the event. And it seems to me, frequently there are signs or there are things that people might have noticed if they had either taken the time or had paid closer attention to what was going on. And these could be, if it's a kid, parents or teachers of a kid that could have called something out that potentially could have headed off the event. I'm sure that there's an analogy here with insider threat mitigation and workforce protection as well. So, I mean, what? How do you guys respond to that kind of a I don't know, was it retroactive examination of events? It's like, oh my goodness, we should have noticed that, this employee was exhibiting odd behavior, or this employee, started, changing their daily routine in ways that should have been obvious to the manager or to the coworkers. How do you guys respond to those kinds of it's almost kind of like an armchair quarterback kind of a thing. Like, if this organization had a better insider threat program, or if the leaders of this organization cared more about their employees, they would have identified that this was a problem before the event happened. How do you guys respond to those kinds of inevitable conversations?
Well, so John, this is exactly the idea behind the potential transition between insider threat recognition and workforce protection, right? We want our people to be well. And what that means is taking a step back and understanding what is going on in our people's lives. And it's different from business to business, right? But the reality is that if we take the time to invest in our people, and if you look at all the literature, they say that our people are our most important resource.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, okay, if that's true, then why aren't we investing in our people? Figuring out what is going on inside of that social emotional landscape so that we can help facilitate wellness and resilience and inside of this complex world. And it's not a cyber thing, even though we like to apply cyber tools to it. I mean, those cyber tools are important, and they can lead to indicators. But the reality is, we need to foster that human connection. And so, I think that anything that we can do to help with that and to facilitate that, it's a big deal.
I would add that, it's not realistic to think that one of these events is not going to happen or that we're ever going to zero out these events. And so that being said, if we take a look at recent events over New Year's, I was watching and reading the news coverage, and people are very quick to say with confidence what happened in the absence of evidence, in the absence of data, things like that. And we need to be really careful that we don't do that. And it's hard. It's hard to say, well, we're collecting information we don't yet know. But one of the things that I'll say it bugs me. People are so quick to say there's a mental illness component to this. There's and that's not always the case. And again, that puts the individual squarely at the center, without understanding the context and without understanding the process and the evolution of how individuals may have gone from a trusted employee with authorized access to someone that harmed the organization. And so when an event does happen, and it will, just like we talk about cybersecurity, right? There's two types of organizations, one that's had a cybersecurity event and one that will. An organization, I think, really needs to be able to articulate to its stakeholders what policies and procedures did it actually have in place to minimize risk. Did they make a good faith effort, informed by best practices and making sure they were appropriately resourced? Did they actually do all of these things, or did they ignore the threat landscape and decide that an insider risk program or proactive measures just weren't worth it? And that, to me, says a lot about a company, an agency, a city, a government's commitment to its employees, to its customers, to its shareholders, too. And so, again, we can't, we need to avoid the desire to quickly make a comment on what just happened. and say, information is forthcoming, and we'll do the after action, we'll do the lessons learned, and make sure that we incorporate all of that into our program planning moving forward.
Yeah. Um, uh, I'm curious if either one of you have ever thought along these lines. So I'll put a link in the show notes, but a while back on the podcast, we had a discussion with author um, Ori Brofman, who wrote a fairly influential, thoughtful book called "The Starfish and the Spider." Maybe you guys have heard of the book, but it's all about organizational resilience and different ways of structuring organizations, an analysis of organizations that are structured differently, whether they're like central, uh, centrally controlled, that's the spider model, or it's a distributed control, that's the starfish model. And the idea is that if you cut the legs off a spider, the spider dies because it's so centrally managed. But if you chop up a starfish, the starfish continues to survive and grow into new starfishes. And anyway, I'm curious if either one of you have um, uh, conducted any research on different organizational models that are more resilient to, like you were just saying, Stephanie. um, Incidents are going to happen, whether they're cyber incidents, insider threat incidents, external shocks, which organizations just have to deal with in order to be viable in today's competitive landscape. Are there organizational models that have different bugs and features when it comes to workforce protection and insider threat?
Well, I think that's a great question, John. The we were actually blessed to have a presentation on the starfish and the spider before we went to Afghanistan from the 10th Mountain Division in 2010, because General Terry at the time, who was our commanding general, very much wanted to have a starfish organization, which is maybe counterintuitive in the Army, right? Yeah, because we I guess in some sense we think that the Army is very much a spider organization. But I think that certainly, when we want to build resilience into organizations, we want to build redundancies in. We want to build um, the opportunity for, when one goes down, the next one can step up. Um, and so we must necessarily not have all of the information centrally located. It's maybe it's more difficult to protect, but it's better in the outcomes, I think.
Mm. Stephanie, do you have any thoughts along this, organizational design that has pros and cons when it comes to insider threat dynamics?
So I think the macro level point that you're getting at, and that I think we've talked about or talked around, is that organizational structure and culture, those are choices. There's nothing inherently necessary about having a command and control structure versus something that's more decentralized. It's not a natural thing or thing that's required. And so in my experience, and I'll talk specifically about insider threat programs, those programs and those structures, I've often seen that it takes quite a personality. I'll call it a force of nature in some cases, who really is the person who gets the program going. right? I mean, it is the person who gets the policies, gets the collaboration, gets the resources, secures buy-in. It really has to have that outspoken advocate and somebody who can talk across kind of different business lines and make the business
Hmm.
case. And
Yeah.
so this force of nature, this person or this small group of people, they will successfully build a program, but that's not necessarily it can't be how you sustain it, because that person will leave, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that team will change.
Hmm.
And so how do you then integrate all of those great steps that you've taken into the fabric of an organization? And that really relies on a hub model, an outreach model, making sure that you have secured understanding of your program buy-in with as many people as possible in your organization who can advocate, who understand what you're trying to do, and to keep it going after you've left. You can't just have a charismatic
Hmm.
leader and then expect the program to keep going.
Right. Do either of you have any?
And John, if I can interject
Oh,
real quick,
sure, sure.
The one of the things that I feel like we're lacking is it's really a cost benefit analysis, right,
Mm,
of a program like this, because as Stephanie said, when you've got that advocate that's a force of nature, things work out very well. But what happens when they leave? Well, okay, we have nothing to stand on unless we have really a document in some sense that says, hey, this is the value of the program,
mm,
and this is the cost, and this is the benefit that we realize, and oh, by the way, the benefit is much greater. So we don't do that very well because we don't have a great understanding of the metrics that help us to justify the utility of these programs.
mm.
This is something that we've got to work
Yeah.
on.
Yeah. Do either of you have any exemplars, either existing today or past exemplars of organizations which are either going down the right path or who have gotten it right with respect to insider threat management and workforce protection?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that I would like to call out any particular organization, but I would like to call out a methodology. In the operations research community, we talk about things like measures of performance and measures of effectiveness. Um, Measures of performance are like, did you do your homework? Did you do it well? And measures of effectiveness are, did you get an A on the test? Okay. Um, there is no doubt about the fact that we have done a lot of things in the insider threat and insider risk communities, and we've done them really, really well. But have we moved the needle? Right. So we have succeeded in our measures of performance, but I'm not sure that we can articulate that we've succeeded in our measures of effectiveness. And this is where we really need to work, going back to the idea of the cost benefit analysis, right? If we're going to talk about, like, this program is value added, we need to talk about how we are doing the right things and not just doing things right. And I this is where I would like to see us, kind of evolve in the out years.
Well, this has been a dynamite discussion, John and Stephanie, and so we'll start wrapping up in our typical fashion. I usually ask people if they could provide a research question for people to examine if they want, but you guys are both researchers, and you've kind of already sketched out a research agenda. But so perhaps you guys could, if there are interested audience members who have some energy in this space or want to get involved, what might an interested audience member do along those lines?
There are a lot of opportunities to connect with others in our community, but if it's okay, I would actually like to add a research question, because it's one that I think is often overlooked, but very, very interesting to explore, challenging to explore, but interesting to explore. So, in the presence of risk factors, why don't things happen, right? And the example that I use, and you're probably going to laugh at this, and the people who might be listening to this, they might laugh at it as well. But I was sitting in a restaurant several years ago with a friend of mine, and we were talking about Beyonce's Lemonade album. This doesn't sound very professional, but hang in there.
Yeah, no,
And
it's a great album, I understand.
and this idea that that album, it didn't leak. No
Mm,
songs were posted ahead of time. And the corresponding kind of long video that was made, that didn't leak. And as I understand it, that production involved probably thousands of people around the world. And these things did not leak out. And our question there, sitting at that restaurant, and we worked together in security, was how did that happen? How did they manage to do that? And so we learn so much from the lessons learned and the after action reports that we've already talked about, but we can learn as well from these situations in which you almost think like in today's day and age, how did something not get out? How is something still protected? And so it's this study of you really thought that something would get leaked and it didn't. And so what can you ask an organization about? What do you have in place? What processes, what procedures? How did you secure your intellectual property? How did you secure your people? And what can we learn from that to complement those after action reports? So
hmm.
that's
No, that's interesting. Yeah, there's probably um, a bunch of examples like that, not just from the music industry, but my younger daughter is a Taylor Swift fan, and I guess just keeping with the music theme, but Taylor Swift has is I guess known by her with her fan base now for surprising fans with these album drops, or maybe not a full album, maybe just like a song or something surprising. But how did that not leak ahead of time, right? And that would be a really cool thing to do, is to cull together uh, I don't know, 20, 50 examples of things that were kind of like you were describing, noteworthy, but there was nothing leaked out in advance of the event happening. Uh,
yeah,
that would be a
yeah.
pretty cool way to look at the problem.
And feel free to borrow the phrase Project Beyonce. That's what we called it.
Okay,
When we
is that right? Okay.
when we did this line of research, and I published a report. My team and we kind of did this first look after this conversation, right, about why things don't happen.
Mm,
And the question that we looked at was, and I don't want to get into a political conversation or anything like that, but police forces today, maybe all the time, and Jon can speak to this as a retired military police officer, it's a high risk environment, high stress environment, access to weapons, things like that. So and the question that we kind of looked at each other and we asked was, why doesn't traditional workplace violence happen inside police forces? They don't, for lack of a better phrase, attack each other. And I remember going to a conference of police and asking this question, and they kind of looked at me like I was crazy, but then they're like, well, that's kind of an interesting question. And I'm not saying that police don't have any organizational issues, because like any organization they do, but they don't seem to have this one. And so what can we learn from the absence of these events? And so whether it's in national security, whether it's in law enforcement, whether it's in private sector business and intellectual property, I do think a lot can be learned from this study of the absence of events. John, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
No, I completely agree with you. It's a cultural issue. And what can we learn about that? Right? Whether or not it's T Swift or Beyonce or Please, it's all a cultural issue, right? I mean, the people that are inside the organization want to protect the organization. That's what it's all about. And so, how do you build that?
Right. There's an analog, I think maybe Stephanie, with some like conspiracy theories, and so people uh, talk about conspiracy, like I don't know, like faking the moon landing, or who shot President Kennedy, the 911. What's the truth behind 911, and um, just like with the Beyonce thing, people not leaking, about something happening in advance. That it's almost it's similar, but it's also different. It's like um, uh, the amount of information security, and the number of people that would have to have stayed silent, or not disclosed what was going on with some of those conspiracy theory kind of things like I was just talking about, would have to be so tight and so vast, with so many people involved. It would almost be it would seemingly be impossible for dozens or thousands of people who like know the truth to actually stay quiet about like what happened about those different kinds of events, in order for the truth not to come out. Do you kind of get what I'm saying? It's a different way of looking at a similar phenomenon.
Yeah, I do hear you. And while I won't put in a proposal to the Department of Defense to study how we've protected the truth about the JFK assassination for so many years, um, they're different insofar as I'm talking obviously about kind of one-time events that people protect, or
Yeah,
a piece
yeah.
of information, but also how a similar question I think that can be derived from conspiracy theorists is how do you sustain that commitment to an organization after you have left?
Mm.
And, people will say, oh, I made them sign an NDA. Well, I'm not so sure that, those work as well or should work as well. And I know there's an ongoing conversation about NDAs now, but let's say somebody did know the formula for Coke, and I'm sure there are many people out there who do over the years. Why didn't, after
Yeah,
they
yeah,
left,
yeah,
why
yeah.
didn't they share it? Why didn't they sell it? And
why why don't they right now? I
exactly.
mean, it's
Yeah.
it's something that is a live phenomenon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And
Huh.
so many people don't. Um,
Hmm.
and I can't remember where I read this or conversation, but people talk about insider trading, people talk about, violating IP or things like that, and or crime in general. And a lot of people ask, why does it happen? But other people ask, why doesn't more of it happen? Right. And and it doesn't. So what are those protections in place
Yeah.
that we can learn from?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, that was an extended cut there on research related stuff. So that was great. Oh, but by the way, Stephanie, is there a link or a report available on Project Beyonce?
Yes, there is a report. Yes, and I'm happy to share it. Can put it in the show notes. And I'm also realizing that I completely blew by the part of your question about how people might get involved, and so I do want to answer that.
Sure.
But for those in the private sector, there's a couple of groups that I would recommend. One is the FBI's InfraGard. This is a great group that connects, businesses with the bureau and with information that is important to businesses in their security practices. I'd recommend the various ISACs, stands for the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, and then INSA, the Intelligence and National Security Alliance as well. And so I recommend those that people take a look at.
Great. And lastly, do either of you have a good book suggestion that an audience member might check out if they're interested in these kinds of topics, or it could be something completely unrelated, but you think would be worthwhile to mention?
Yeah, so I have one, and it's really the same book that I recommend all the time because it is a wonderful culture book. It's a book called Legacy about the New Zealand All Blacks. It's 15 lessons from the All Blacks to the business world, and it is really all about building solid culture inside of an organization. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about workforce protection. We're talking about cultural development. This is it's a big deal. And when we get back to basics and focus on the humanity inside of our organization, well, I mean, we don't have as much of a threat problem.
All right.
Yeah, mine would be over the break, I actually read the book Premonition by Michael Lewis. Specifically, it's about COVID and the COVID pandemic. But it's not just about that. It's about preparedness. It's about futures thinking. And it's about how we choose to prioritize issues and who we choose to listen to. And so I really enjoyed that book. Again, it's about COVID specifically, but for those of us in security, I think there's a lot of valuable lessons about how we work to be proactive to eventually get to a place where we can prevent things from happening.
All right, fantastic suggestions. We'll have links to those and other resources mentioned during the show in our show notes. And with that, Jon Roginski and Stephanie Jaros, thank you both so much for being guests on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you, Jon.
Thank you so much.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.